Welcome back to Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Last time we finally beat 1-4. Recording that took forever, but it's done now. And we met up with a few interesting companions. Raphael, another survivor of the Serenades Royals, and 2 Wolf Lagoos. Now, we'll see where we're going next.
The history of Tellius is a history of warfare, or so the troubadours sing.
Again, they're not in this game.
It is a history of unending conflict between the Bjork and the Lagoos, a history penned in blood and scarred by mistrust. The Bjork fight with the weapons of man, the sword, the axe, the lance, and the magic arts, while the Lagoos, able to transform into beast, bird, and dragon, are weapons unto themselves. Both were created equally by the goddess, but neither race has ever accepted the other. The Heron Prince, Raphael, the Wolf Queen of Hatari, Nyla, and her vassal, Volug. Is the Dawn Brigade's meeting with these 3 Lagoos chance, or a sign of things to come? Micaiah can only wonder.
Given that they were drawn together by a mysterious voice, obviously it was a giant plot device that led them together, so it's important. Desert of Death Outskirts Obsolete Lodgings. That's a pretty dramatic name here. Yet again, Micaiah's smell bag is telling us that we need to do something. I love the visual here. And again, her visions are extremely vague. So, you mean every Fire Emblem game? This really sums up pretty much every game in the series. Oh no, going to a desert in a Fire Emblem game usually means bad things for gameplay. But this map's not really all that bad. And here we are back at the base. So just like I did with Path of Radiance, I'll start with info. And yeah, there are a lot more 3-star conversations in this game. In fact, let's just do them in order. So that wasn't just for flavor and background. So, plus the 3,000 we got from the chest, that means we've got quite a lot on our hands. You get a decent amount of gold in Part 1. I will say though, gold is nowhere near as plentiful as it was in Path of Radiance, especially in Part 3. So, we will be getting some gems later in Part 1, and it's actually worth your while to not sell them, and instead to transfer them to Part 3, because they're very strapped for cash over there. I'll explain how to do that once we get to the end of Part 1. And that pretty much sums up Soph. He just follows Micaiah's orders. And hey there, Nyla. Actually, this conversation is very interesting. So, you get the reward from this conversation whether you do it or not. Please tell me we're getting Raphael out of this conversation. Or Nyla. Nyla's a Lagoos Royal after all, and in Path of Radiance we know how strong they are. You could join. Raphael could join. I'd take either one of you. Yeah, admittedly having Lagoos traveling with an army that's trying to liberate Dayan might cause bad things for our reputation. Volug doesn't talk very much, but he's actually a very interesting character. I'll discuss more about that later. And yet, he is a wolf Lagoose. Well, gigantic wolf that mauls people to death, but, I mean, it is a desert. It's not like you're taking him into civilized settlements or anything like that. This is my pet wolf. So, this is a bit of gameplay and story integration. If you remember the demi-band from Path of Radiance, that's what half-shifting is. A half-shifted Lagoose can stay in beast form constantly, but their stats are only multiplied by 1.5 rather than 2. Nyla's mouth wasn't moving for the first part of the line there. And yes, more than a match for any Bjork is right. Also, that's kind of good. Volug really doesn't mind. As you'll be seeing later, Volug can dish it out as well as he can take it. But you won't really know that, because Volug doesn't speak the common tongue at all. Trust me, Volug is equally blunt. And with that, we recruit Volug, but you still get him anyway, even if you skip that conversation. It'll just happen at the beginning of the chapter. So, here's Volug. Oh no, it's a shirtless werewolf! Run, Volug, before the Twilight fangirls get you! Yeah, that joke is kind of dated now, but Radiant Dawn actually came out around the height of Twilight Mania, so it fits. Anyway, Volug is the first Lagoose we recruit in Radiant Dawn, and he's one of the most important characters in Part 1, so much so that you actually get a game over if he dies for the majority of this pass. So, I explained Lagoose in the tutorial in 1.4. In this game, their stats double upon transformation, which makes Volug's stats look pretty crazy. However, Volug, at least in Part 1, is a very atypical Lagoose. He starts with this skill called Wild Heart, which is basically a skill version of the demi-band from the last game. It lets a Lagoose transform at will, but with only half the usual transform boosts. In this case, their stats are multiplied by 1.5 instead of 2. So Volug's actual stats look like this in half-shifted form. Why is it so significant that I show these stats? Because Volug is permanently half-shifted during Part 1. He cannot untransform, and you can't remove Wild Hearts. They do justify this by the story, but it's a weird way to introduce Lagoose from a gameplay standpoint. Volug mainly serves as secondary Jagan during Part 1. His stats might not be as good as his full transform stats, but they're still very strong by Part 1 standards. And he also has crazy mobility, especially since he can ignore most terrain penalties. His main weakness is not being able to counterattack at 2 range, which is a problem that all Lagoos suffer from. Volug does start with another skill that can punish indirect attackers though. Howl is exclusive to Beast Tribe units, and has a strength over 2% chance of causing an indirect attacker to be paralyzed for 1 turn. It's nice when it works, but you probably won't see it much during Part 1. And speaking of that, Volug is a lot like Soth in that he loses a lot of his usefulness after Part 1 is over. At that point, you can stop using Wild Heart, so he will have access to his full transform stats. But, as you can see, apart from HP and luck, his growths are horrible. So he's gonna be stuck with pretty close to his base stats for most of the game. And while they're good for Part 1, they're just barely enough to get him by during Part 3, and he will become a bit of a glass cannon by that point. And beyond that, well, let's just say we'll be getting a much better wolf, so there's no real reason to bring him to endgame. But Volug is still incredibly useful during Part 1. Oh, and he also has Earth Affinity, which is nice. Yeah, as you can see, there's a lock on his Wild Heart skill. This can't be removed during the entirety of Part 1. You can do it starting with later in the game, though. Anyway, Volug will be basically our second Jagan next to Soth, and he's really useful during Part 1. That HP is massive, and his other stats are pretty good too. He does drop off in usefulness later on, though. So let's see the rest of the info conversations. Laura and Aaron, the two who desperately deserve more development together, but they didn't get it because this game hates newcomers. I feel like we should have got this base conversation in the last chapter. apologizing for your poor choice in employers should be a thing for all recruitable characters in Fire Emblem. Yeah, I'd heard about that too. Benyon is pretty big on their religion, so it only makes sense they'd send their own approved ministers in here. Well, good to see some places in Dane have been spared. Oh yes, and then this line. This is amazing. So, yeah, being compared to bandits in Fire Emblem is usually a bad thing. Unless it's to Gonzalez. Gonzalez is pretty cool. But these conversations are sadly some of the few development the Dawn Brigade get. That's a really cool background. I haven't actually played this game very much on an HD TV with the Wii on the HD setting, and it actually looks better than I remember it. This conversation's interesting because we can see that Edward is the optimist here, and Leonardo is the, I guess, realist. Pessimist sounds a bit negative. Well, normally I would, object to Edward saying that, but she does have foresight powers, although admittedly they're very vague. It's improved quite a bit. I wouldn't say tenfold. That's for much later. And it's so ironic that Edward is saying this just before a character who makes him obsolete joins. But I'm still going to be using Edward anyway. But with Nolan and Soth on our side, and now Volug, we probably all can. And Nolan at least gets some lines too. And of course, it's about training. Nolan is kind of like the Dawn Brigade's equivalent to Titania in some ways. In more ways than one, actually, because he gets called old by people. So, that is one thing that annoys me a lot about this game. The new characters had potential. Those conversations were both really great, and yet it's just wasted by not giving them supports. Anyway, yeah. So, are there any new supports I can do? You can't even support Aaron yet. It doesn't look like there are new supports I can do, sadly. Okay, in terms of manage, I don't think anyone's ready to use bonus experience just yet. Before you've capped stats, it's actually better to leave yourself at high experience and go into the chapter and get your first level up quickly, and then you can reset if it's bad. Unlike Path of Radiance, where you want to end chapters with a lot of experience so that you can cap yourself off with bonus experience, because there's no difference between bonus experience levels and regular levels. There is here. So now I can show what this skill that we just got does. Beast Foe. You do bonus damage against Beast Lagoos with all your attacks, so triple might on your weapons against them. That would have been really useful to have back in the previous chapter, so it is pointless to assign Beast Foe during part 1, because you never fight any more Beast Lagoos after 1-4. But we want to keep that, because it's going to be very useful later. Now, are there any other skills that I want to move around? You can remove Howl, but since only Beast Lagoos can use it, and Volga's your only Beast Lagoos at this point, there's no point in doing that. Howl is kind of weird. I believe that's... is it speed percent? I think it works off of some weird stat. But it's kind of like the raw skill from Path of Radiance, except it works on your attacks rather than as a command. And Ileana still has Shade, by the way, which you can remove and assign to other characters if you want. Maybe I should give that to someone. Though I'm not sure who I should give that to. Micaiah could make some use of that, but, oh yeah, as you can see, Micaiah has more capacity than everyone else. That will be important a little later into part 1. Now that we've got a ton of gold, though, let's see what they're selling in the armory. Bronze swords and iron swords, not all that much, really. In fact, I don't think his inventory has changed at all since the last chapter. But let's check out Imy's bargains. So as you can see here, any items that we didn't buy during the last chapter, which in this case is the main staff, are now gone. But instead, we have a wind edge. Wind edge. Yes, buy that now. Definitely want that, and that's obviously going on Edward. These two are extremely expensive, so you want to think carefully before you decide to buy them. The arm scroll can help, but yeesh, that's a lot of gold. And there will be some good bargains coming up later on. I don't think I need an extra elf under either. If you're training Ileana, you might want to do that, but I don't think I need that. And again, with the iron longbow, if you're training Leonardo, you might want this, but I don't think I do. I mean, it is a C rank in bows, and Leonardo does have a C rank. I could make some use out of that, but I think I might want to just not get that for now. Like I said, there will be better bargains later in the game. So let's see, you definitely want a Convoy Beast Foe, and that Pure Water. Actually, the Pure Water might not be that bad, because there are some pretty strong mages in this chapter. In fact, you know, I'm going to actually... Edward's got way too much stuff, but maybe he can take this Pure Water. Pure Water plus Wind Edges equals a lot of dead mages. Let me see how Edward's doing. He's actually doing pretty decently. In fact, his strength's only 1 point below Nolan's. And it might seem like I'm only training Edward and Nolan at this point. That will change. And yeah, thankfully Aaron's defense is starting to get a lot better. Are there any better lances I can use? I don't think so. And let's convoy the chest key, because we won't be needing that in this chapter. As for everyone else... You know what? I'm actually going to go ahead, and now that Edward has enough strength to use Steel Swords without penalty, let's swap out the Meg Steel Sword for Edward's. And I think we should be good for now. So, let's head on out to the chapter. Here we are in the desert. Thankfully, this map does not have a lot of desert terrain. Oh no, being lost in the desert is a bad thing. However, we have someone who knows the area on our side. Someone who likely has a keen sense of smell, too. Also, Lagoos have that weird sensing thing as well. That actually sounds like someone we know. Ha! I recognize that white armor, and I recognize that face. Hey there, Taroniu! Taroniu was a pretty cool character in the last game, but he didn't really get to do all that much. He gets a much expanded role in this game, though. And hey there, Z-Hawk! It's been a while since we've last seen you. Yes! 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 My favorite character in the entire duology, she's back, and she's better than ever! It's the return of some old friends. If only you knew, Soth. If only you knew. I'll just say it now, Soth actually has special conversations with all three of them. And before I end this part, I just want to go ahead and show the three of them. It's just so cool seeing old friends from Path of Radiance. Here's Z-Hawk. He still has Adept. Swordmasters get plus 10 critical in this game. Here's Taroniu. His stats are insane. And his weapon ranks are insane. And his starting weapons are insane. And he still has Resolve, though I should mention, Resolve got nerfed. It does not buff strength anymore, it only buffs skill and speed. It's still very good, it's just not as broken as it was in the last game. And it also got a buff in the English version. In the Japanese version, it had a strength % chance of triggering. Here it's always active if you're below half HP. And finally, it's Jill. Now, Jill's stats might look a little bit different for you. That's because my Jill has transfer bonuses. So, I used her in Path of Radiance. I definitely plan on using her here. No skills, though, apart from this. In fact, Jill, I believe, is the first time we're seeing the Kanto skill. So, mounted units have this, which lets them use up their remaining movement after attacking. It's what makes them so broken in the Tellius games. Well, in Radiant Dawn, mostly flyers. Cavalry aren't as broken. Sadly, in Radiant Dawn, Kanto takes up a skill slot, and it costs a whopping 10 capacity too, so Jill doesn't really have room for much in the way of skills in Part 1, until she promotes at least. And with showing them off, I'll end this part now. See you next time for when we rush to their rescue. Not that Zihak and Toronto need help.